Today we are continuing our study in the book of Romans, and we are beginning the 4th chapter together. And today we'll be studying verses 1 to 12. We're going to study chapter 4 in 2 parts. Today we'll do part A, and next time we will do part B together. But as we enter into chapter 4, we see that Paul has finished explaining the essence of the gospel in chapter 3. Through chapters 1, 2, and 3, Paul has been unfolding the great problem, which is our sinfulness and the fact that we are under God's wrath and holy condemnation. And in chapter 3, he has finally unveiled for us the glory of what God has done in and through Jesus Christ, and through his cross, through his death and glorious resurrection, how God has saved a people for himself, and that is the good news of the gospel. And so Paul could have ended the book of Romans at the end of chapter 3, because he's finished his purpose in terms of explaining, at least in basic terms, the gospel. Paul is talking to Roman believers who do not have a full understanding of his gospel. We said at the very beginning that this is Paul's masterwork, his magnum opus, and he is speaking to a majority of people who have not met him personally. And so he wants to unfold the gospel in all of its glory. And so he's going to continue now in chapter 4 to flesh out the gospel that has been presented in chapters 1 to 3. And so at the end of chapter 3, Paul had ended with this question, because he's been talking about the gospel and how with the gospel, which is by faith alone, there is no boasting. It is excluded because the law of faith is what we are depending upon. And so he says in verse 31, the last verse of chapter 3, "Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law." And so what Paul is doing is now he's going to launch into a defense of the deeper truths of the gospel in meeting the objection that says, it sounds like you are throwing the law into the garbage can, and you are nullifying the holy law of God for the sake of faith, because you're saying faith alone, faith apart from good works, apart from works of the law, are what pleases God, and faith is actually the thing that actually saves, because that is how God justifies sinful people, through faith in Jesus Christ alone. And so now Paul has to defend against the objection that he is nullifying the law. And this is what we're going to see in chapter 4, starting in verses 1 to 12. And so let's take a look at that together. So starting in verse 1, "What then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh?" And Paul is doing something very wise here, because the law, when we talk about the law, ultimately we're talking about Moses on Mount Sinai. Moses is the mediator through whom God gave the law to Israel, and through whom God made his covenant with the nation of Israel. And so Paul is going to trump all of that immediately. He is going to go even further back than Moses. He is going to go to the very founder of the Israelite family and of the Israelite faith and of the Israelite religion, monotheism, in the belief in the one true and living God. So Paul is going to say, let's go back to the very beginning. Let's go back to Abraham. And so he says, let's consider Abraham for a moment. What did Abraham learn in this matter of faith versus works? So verse 2 says, "For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about." Remember back in chapter 3, Paul had just said that boasting is excluded. If all of this is a free gift from God, given by his grace, given on the basis of the redemption and propitiation obtained through Christ's costly cross, if it's all free, then there's no boasting. We cannot boast before God. We cannot boast above our fellow human beings. But Paul's saying here, if Abraham was justified by works, that means if he was declared righteous by God by means of his obedience and his good works before God, then Paul says he has something to boast about, but not before God. Abraham was still a sinner, so he couldn't boast before God ultimately. But the boast that Abraham would have would be over other people, over people who rejected God or worshiped false gods or just sinned in general. If Abraham was justified by works, he could look at other people and say, man, I'm really good. I deserve this grace from God. I deserve to be delivered and saved by God. I have a boast. Paul says he would have something to boast about. Verse 3 says, for what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. There the Apostle Paul is quoting the book of Genesis, chapter 15, verse 6. And this is the second time that God has appeared to Abraham. In the first instance, he appeared in chapter 12, and that's when he called Abraham out of his family's land to go to the promised land of Canaan. In chapter 12, God had told Abraham, I will make you into a blessing for all nations. Those who bless you will be blessed. Those who curse you will be cursed. But then in chapter 15, that's where God actually makes a covenant with Abraham. That's where God specifically says, I'm going to give you, Abraham, offspring. Because Abraham says, I've got no heir. This guy, Eliezer of Damascus, is going to inherit everything I have. So I have no heritage, no inheritance to pass on to someone else, because Abraham and Sarah had no children. And so it's in chapter 15 that God promises that Abraham himself will have a son in his extreme old age. And it's that promise that Abraham believes in chapter 15, and it's on that basis of Abraham's faith in God's faithfulness that then God makes this covenant with Abraham. And so this is a key verse for the Apostle Paul. Abraham believed God, Abraham trusted God, Abraham had faith in God, and this was counted to him as righteousness. Abraham hadn't done anything, Abraham hadn't done any good work, but just the simple acceptance and trust that God was able to do this impossible thing in Abraham's mind. It was an impossible act that God was promising to do, and just the faith that God could do it and would do it and will do it is what God counted to Abraham as righteousness in Genesis chapter 15. And so Paul is going to use this principle to talk about how our faith in Jesus Christ does the same thing. God receives our faith in Jesus Christ and his death and resurrection, and God declares us not guilty. He justifies us only based on that faith, not because of any good thing that we have done, not because we have been obedient to his law. And so in verse 4, now Paul is going to explain this principle that he's talking about. Now to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. This is a key verse here in Paul's thinking, because what Paul's saying here, and this is an obvious principle, we know this. Just imagine if you worked for someone at a job for 6 months and you hadn't received a paycheck and the boss wasn't giving you any money for all the work that you were doing. So you go into the boss's office and you say, hey boss, where's my money? He says, well, I don't feel like giving you any. Well, wouldn't you get really angry because you say, no, you owe me that money. I have worked for you. I have sweated for you. I have done all of these things to grow your company and to serve you. And this was what you had promised me, that you would give me remuneration. You owe me this. I have a right to this money that you owe me. And so Paul is working off of that principle that we all understand. If you work for something, then you are owed wages. Therefore, if we come before God and we say, God, I've done all these good works for you, you owe it to me to save me. I deserve to be saved. But Paul is saying a wage is not like a gift. It's not like a free gift. And in verse 4 it says, kata karen, which means according to grace. It's not counted as a gift. NASB says it's not credited as a favor. It is as his due. It's an obligation, the NIV says. The KJV puts it very bluntly, but it's out of debt. You owe it to me. Verse 5, and to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. And so here in verse 5, Paul says that when you don't work, but rather you believe in God, you have faith in him who justifies the ungodly, who don't deserve this free gift, who don't deserve this grace. When you believe in that God, that miracle-working, faithful, promise-keeping God, your faith is counted as righteousness by him. And so Paul is showing the difference between working for something and it being owed to you, or receiving a free gift by grace. That's what Paul is showing, the contrast here. And then Paul brings in King David. Verse 6, he says, just as David also speaks of the blessing of the one to whom God counts righteousness apart from works. So again, it's apart from works. It's separate from good works from the law. David himself knew of this grace. He knew of the blessedness that comes when God does not count our sins against us. So verse 7 and 8 are quoted from Psalm chapter 32, verses 1 and 2. And here David the psalmist says, blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sin. And so Paul brings more scriptural evidence. Abraham was credited righteousness because of his faith. And now David is saying something very similar here in Psalm 32. That the blessed man is the one whom the Lord does not count his sins. That's that same word, legizomai. The Lord does not credit his sin because the Lord has credited righteousness to him instead. Paul moves on in verse 9 and he says, is this blessing then only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? So is it only for Jews, or is this blessing for everybody? It's also for the Gentiles. Because look at what David had said. Blessed is the man. It doesn't say the Jewish man. It doesn't say the Jewish people in verse 7. It says, blessed is the person whom the Lord does not count the sin. And so Paul asks, is this just for the Jews or also for the Gentiles? For we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? And so for Paul, here the chronology is important. Was faith credited as righteousness before God before Abraham was circumcised or after Abraham was circumcised? Paul points out it was actually before he was circumcised. That's when that happened. Verse 11, he received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well. So God counts Abraham's faith to him as righteousness before he was uncircumcised, Paul says, while he was technically a Gentile, we could say. While Abraham was a Gentile, God credited faith as righteousness to him. And Paul's saying the reason God did that was to show that Abraham is the father of all who have faith, not just of the Jewish people who are circumcised under the sign of the covenant, but all people who put their faith in God, that he is the faithful one, he is the promise keeper, he can do the impossible, he can bring life from death. They also, like Abraham, in his uncircumcised state, they can receive this declaration of acquittal and not guilty, to be declared righteous as well in God's sight. And Paul finishes up in verse 12, and to make him, that is Abraham, the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. And so Paul doesn't forget about the Jews. He says this principle includes the Gentiles, but it also includes the Jews as well, who are not just merely circumcised in an outward way, as an outward sign, but those Jews who also have faith in God in the heart, who are circumcised of the heart, so that righteousness would be counted to all, to Jews as well as Gentiles. And so Paul has showed us today in this passage that this faith goes all the way back to Abraham. A faith in God's promises, a faith in God's faithfulness to keep his promises. That the kind of faith that Abraham had in believing God, that God would keep his promise of an heir given to Abraham, is the same kind of faith that we put in Jesus Christ, that we put in God through the work of Jesus Christ. It's the same faith. In a certain way, what Paul means here is that Abraham's faith in God's promise at that time, in Genesis 15, was actually a forward-looking faith that was ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ. That Abraham's faith, his forward-looking faith in God's promise, is the same faith that we have as we look backwards to the cross of Jesus Christ. That it is a free gift given by grace. It's not by works. It's not something that God owes us in response to all the good things that we have done for him. No, it is a free gift that God has given on the basis of faith.